The war did not begin with bulldozers, yet it could not have been won without them. In the shadows of tanks and bombers, these silent steel beasts shaped the ground on which victory marched. Winter 1944. Near the shattered abbey of Monte Cassino, the wind carried the echo of artillery and the scent of diesel. Amid the frozen mud stood a massive yellow machine, half buried in rubble. An American Caterpillar D7 bulldozer abandoned after a shell burst. Its blade was dented, its paint scorched, but even in ruin, it radiated power. When German engineers approached under Allied supervision, they did not expect to be impressed. To them, American machinery meant crude strength without finesse, a people who built for quantity, not artistry. Yet as they examined the machine's lines, its balance, its compact hydraulic arms, something in their professional pride hesitated. This was no farmer's toy. This was a weapon of logistics, a machine that cleared mines, cut roads, built airstrips, and leveled enemy fortifications faster than men could destroy them. By that stage of the war, bulldozers were everywhere, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma. The United States had transformed peaceful industries into an engine of military infrastructure. Between 1941 and 1945, Caterpillar alone produced more than 60,000 tractors and bulldozers. Factories in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania ran day and night, adapting civilian designs into armored, field-ready workhorses. They did not shoot or bomb, yet each machine paved the way for 1,000 rifles to advance. Engineers like Lieutenant Helmut Roessler, once a designer for Krupp, stared at the machine's massive undercarriage and muttered in disbelief. He later wrote in his diary, "The Americans wage war by building, not by breaking." Around him, Allied troops laughed and called the bulldozer their frontline carpenter. They used it to flatten pillboxes, fill craters, and carve supply routes through the impossible. What once took weeks of manual labor could now be done in hours. It was a different kind of warfare, not just destructive, but constructive. The machine in the mud symbolized a new doctrine. The victory depended not only on killing the enemy, but on sustaining momentum, on keeping the army fed, fueled, and mobile. The Germans had perfected precision, but the Americans had perfected progress. And as the cold wind blew across the Italian hills, the captured engineers realized this bulldozer was not merely a tool. It was an idea forged in steel, an emblem of a nation that believed building was itself an act of war. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. And tell us in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it where you are right now? When the engineers began dismantling the machine, the sound of steel against steel echoed through the ruined valley. Under Allied supervision, 3 German specialists, Oberstleutnant Weber, mechanic Hans Kraus, and engineer Helmut Roessler, set to work. Their hands, once accustomed to the precision of tank transmissions and aircraft engines, now loosened bolts on something that looked deceptively simple. Yet with every turn of the wrench, their confidence thinned. The first revelation came from the track assembly. The bulldozer's continuous track was designed not for elegance, but for endurance. Each link could be detached and replaced with basic tools. No specialized instruments, no factory recalibration. Kraus, crouching beside the steel teeth, whispered to Weber, "If one link fails, a soldier could fix it in the mud." Weber didn't answer. He was staring at the suspension system, its balance of weight and durability. It was as if the Americans had designed it, knowing that perfection meant nothing without practicality. They opened the gearbox next. Expecting intricate gears and tight tolerances, they instead found rugged, modular construction, bolts labeled with uniform markings, parts that could fit across multiple models. Roessler scribbled notes, underlining 3 words: standardized, scalable, soldier-proof. He had spent years watching German engineers chase refinement at the expense of field repair. A broken Panzer tank might remain idle for weeks because one gear tooth required a special order from Kassel or Magdeburg. This bulldozer, by contrast, could be revived anywhere. Then came the moment that silenced them. Beneath the operator's seat, they discovered a small metal tag stamped with numbers and a name. Caterpillar Tractor Co., Peoria, Illinois. Next to it, someone had scratched initials, likely a factory worker. Krauss traced them with a gloved finger, and for a second, the war felt smaller. A nameless American laborer had built this machine, confident that his work would cross oceans and change the course of battles he would never see. The deeper they went, the clearer the philosophy became: power through simplicity, reliability through repetition. The Americans had designed a machine that could outlast chaos. Weber's diary that night recorded a quiet admission. Our machines demand engineers. Theirs trust workers. In the cold barracks that evening, they argued softly over coffee rations and fading pride. Could a nation so young surpass centuries of German engineering tradition? Krauss argued that it wasn't superior genius, but superior planning. Every detail designed to be understood, every mechanism meant to survive misuse. Weber, staring at the floor, murmured, "Then that is genius." Outside, the bulldozer stood half dismantled, its parts laid out in order like a language waiting to be read. For the first time, these men began to sense that the real battlefield might not be fought with tanks or planes, but with ideas hidden in bolts and blueprints. Days later, they saw the bulldozer not in parts, but in action. On the outskirts of Naples, a column of American engineers from the Fifth Army was clearing the road to Cassino. Mud swallowed boots, rain blurred the hills, and artillery fire still cracked in the distance. Yet through the storm, the bulldozer moved forward, blade down, roaring against the earth. Trees, wreckage, and half-collapsed walls yielded to its sheer force. Weber and Krauss, standing under guard, watched in disbelief. This machine was not a bystander of war. It was part of the offensive itself. The American engineers behind the controls treated it like a living thing, shouting orders over the noise, synchronizing their movements as if conducting an orchestra. Each push of its blade changed the terrain. A crater disappeared. A new path emerged. Within hours, trucks and tanks rolled where, that morning, only rubble had existed. That was when Roessler murmured the phrase that would later be remembered in his diary: "It builds victory." It was not a compliment. It was an awakening. He realized that American warfare operated on a principle alien to the German mindset: speed through reconstruction. Where the Wehrmacht saw obstacles to bypass or destroy, the U.S. Army saw earth to move, rivers to bridge, ruins to flatten, and ground to reclaim. The machine itself was not only practical, it symbolized a culture of perpetual forward motion. In Normandy, thousands of miles away, that same principle defined the D-Day campaign. More than 1,500 bulldozers landed with the Allied invasion force. They smashed through the Atlantic Wall, dragged away wrecked landing craft, and carved new roads up the cliffs of Omaha and Utah beaches. Without them, supply convoys would have bogged down in sand and mud, and tanks could not have pushed inland. Each dozer blade was as vital as a rifle. The engineers had never imagined such a scale of construction warfare. Germany had fielded powerful weapons: Tiger tanks, V-2 rockets, jet fighters, yet its front lines crumbled whenever logistics failed. The Allies, by contrast, turned their bulldozers into mobile foundations of empire. They could build an airfield overnight or a bridge before dawn. A U.S. report from 1944 recorded that bulldozers cleared over 12 million cubic yards of debris in Italy alone. For Weber, these numbers hit harder than shell fire. He confessed to his diary, "We thought the Americans had no soul for engineering, but this is engineering with soul, to make Earth itself obey." By dusk, as the machine's engine quieted and steam rose from its grill, the German engineers remained silent. The bulldozer's blade gleamed under the fading sun, streaked with mud and victory. They no longer saw an enemy weapon. They saw a civilization's heartbeat made of iron and determination. By spring 1945, the German engineers had begun to understand what lay beneath that machine's strength. Not the steel itself, but the invisible web that sustained it. Logistics. It was the quiet war within the war, the bloodstream of every campaign. Without it, even the most brilliant design was a corpse. In one camp near Huntsville, Texas, Oberstleutnant Weber was shown a U.S. Army maintenance depot. Long rows of crates, each stamped with the same codes he had seen on the Bulldozer parts: D7 track, bolt type 9, pin assembly number 11. Everything was labeled, cataloged, and interchangeable. A soldier in greasy overalls could locate any part in minutes. Weber stood silently, realizing that this order, this predictability was America's true weapon. During the war, the U.S. had established more than 2,000 supply depots across multiple continents, all synchronized through a single numbering system. Fuel drums, spark plugs, and track pads followed the same logic as bullets and rations. Every field repair team knew that whatever machine they encountered, a Jeep, a Sherman, or a Caterpillar, its components could be replaced without improvisation. Krause, the mechanic, studied one of the standardized track links. "They've made war like factory work," he muttered. Weber replied softly, "And factory work like war." This revelation cut deep. Germany's engineering elite had prided themselves on custom craftsmanship, on machines so finely tuned they were almost artistic. But under Allied bombing, that pride became a burden. Each destroyed factory crippled production, each missing part halted a division. The Americans, meanwhile, had sacrificed refinement for reproducibility, and in doing so, had built something indestructible. There was another truth the engineers couldn't ignore. Logistics required not just parts, but people. Thousands of supply clerks, truck drivers, and dock workers operated like cogs in a human machine. To the Germans, it was astonishing that a democracy could marshal such unity without coercion. Their soldiers fixed their own engines, Weber wrote in his journal. Our men wait for orders. One afternoon, an American sergeant demonstrated how quickly a bulldozer's track could be replaced. He and two workers lifted the damaged section with improvised jacks, bolted the new link, refilled oil, and had it running in under 30 minutes. Krause timed it. 31 minutes, he said. We would need a day. When they walked back to the barracks that evening, they said little. The sunset flared red behind the camp's watchtower, and somewhere in the distance, another engine started. The sound seemed eternal, the rhythm of a nation that never allowed motion to stop. Weber's final note that night captured the paradox perfectly. They do not worship machines. They trust them because they trust their system. The weeks in captivity began to blur, yet one thing grew sharper with time: the friction between pride and realization. Inside the wooden barracks of Camp McCain, Mississippi, where over 7,000 German POWs lived, a debate broke out that would last until lights out. The subject was the bulldozer, that simple, stubborn symbol of American ingenuity. It started with a passing comment from Weber as he read through his notebook. Perhaps we were never the better engineers, only the more complicated ones. The remark landed like a grenade. Younger officers protested immediately. "Nonsense!" shouted Lieutenant Vogel, once a draftsman for Henschel. "Our Tiger tank could tear that machine in half." Krause replied dryly, "Yes, if it ever reached the battlefield without breaking a transmission." The laughter that followed was tense, uneasy. Even in defeat, they needed to believe in something. The conversation spread to the next bunk. Some prisoners still defended the German way: precision, craftsmanship, pride. Others began to see that perfection without resilience was a dead end. Roessler, the quietest of them all, pointed at the ceiling beams. "You see these? Straight, uniform, replaceable. That's how the Americans build. They assume things will fail, so they prepare for it." He took a slow sip of the thin camp coffee and added, "That's not weakness, that's realism." Their guards occasionally joined in. One American mechanic, Sergeant William Bill Harding from Ohio, had a habit of wandering into their barracks after shift. He spoke German clumsily but enthusiastically, teasing them about over-engineering everything from rifles to coffee pots. One evening, he dropped a simple question that silenced the room. "If something's too perfect to fix, Is it really perfect? No one answered. Weber stared at the floor, tracing a line in the dust with his boot. That night, he wrote a sentence he would never forget. Defeat does not always come from weakness. Sometimes it comes from refusing to simplify. Still, not everyone was ready to accept it. Pride is a slow enemy. Some prisoners whispered that the Americans built machines for fools, too crude to reflect real genius. Others stayed awake, thinking of those machines clearing roads in France and Belgium while they slept behind wire. By May, the argument had turned into a quiet obsession. They began sketching improvements, redesigning bulldozer parts from memory, comparing American practicality with German precision. The barracks became a classroom of reluctant admiration. And to you, the listener, what do you think matters more in times of war or peace? The beauty of design or the wisdom of making it repairable? Would you trust the perfect machine or the one that never stops running? The lights went out. Only the wind and the faint hum of distant engines remained. A lullaby of motion, reminding them that somewhere beyond the fences, the machines of democracy still moved through the night. Summer 1945. The war in Europe had ended, yet inside the POW camps of America, the hum of industry continued. Rows of bulldozers stood in open fields awaiting repair. Machines that had served on European and Pacific fronts now resting under southern skies. It was here that the former German engineers, still in khaki remnants with faded insignia, found unexpected work, restoring the very machines that had once rolled over their defenses. Each morning, they reported to the camp's mechanical yard under the guidance of American technicians. Sergeant Bill Harding, the same man who had teased them months earlier, now became their supervisor. He handed them manuals printed in simple diagrams, no jargon, no secrecy. Krauss turned the pages with fascination. Even a farmer could fix this, he murmured, half in admiration, half in disbelief. Harding grinned. That's the point. We build for farmers, not philosophers. As they worked side by side, the atmosphere changed. Silence gave way to conversation, then to laughter over stripped bolts and stubborn gears. They traded cigarettes and stories. Roessler shared that before the war, he had designed locomotive pistons. Harding replied that his father built tractors in Illinois. Two men on opposite sides of a shattered world, bound by grease and the logic of metal. One afternoon, a bulldozer stalled, a cracked valve in its fuel line. Weber, without thinking, joined Harding beneath the chassis. Together, they rerouted the tubing with wire and tape, making it run again in 15 minutes. The machine roared to life, startling a flock of birds nearby. Harding clapped him on the shoulder. "You're pretty good for a German," he said. Weber replied softly, "I used to build tanks. This feels better." That moment marked a quiet shift. Repair became redemption. For these prisoners, every restored machine carried the weight of reconciliation. They were still enemies in uniform, yet their hands moved with shared purpose. Each bolt tightened, felt like a word unspoken between nations. Some nights, they would sit by the fence, watching the headlights of bulldozers testing in the dark. Krauss once whispered, "When I return home, I will build something that lasts." Roessler nodded. We have all learned how not to build. That is a beginning. And to you, watching now, can you imagine such a moment? When the men who once fought each other found peace in fixing what had destroyed them? Would you have been able to cross that invisible line to work beside your former enemy? The next morning, a new shipment of machines arrived from Europe, dented, burned, mud-caked. The engineers stood waiting, tools in hand. The war was over, but for them, the rebuilding had just begun. Autumn 1946. The air in Stuttgart carried the scent of coal smoke and wet earth. The city, once a proud industrial center, now lay wounded. Streets choked with rubble, factories gutted, and trams running on skeleton tracks. Amid the ruins, a convoy of American trucks arrived, each carrying something unexpected: bulldozers. The same yellow machines the German engineers had once examined as prisoners now rumbled into their homeland, bearing a different mission. Weber, released months earlier and working under the Allied Reconstruction Office, stood at the roadside as one of the Caterpillar D7s rolled past. It was freshly painted, its blade gleaming despite the dust. He recognized the model instantly. Every bolt, every hydraulic joint. His chest tightened with a strange blend of pride and humility. This machine, which had once torn through defenses, was now clearing paths for schools and hospitals. The operation was part of the U.S. aid initiative that began even before the Marshall Plan. Between 1945 and 1947, over 3,000 American bulldozers and tractors were shipped into Germany to rebuild infrastructure, bridges, roads, water lines. Each carried not destruction, but renewal. Children waved from windows as the machines pushed aside rubble that had lain untouched since the bombings of 1944. Krauss joined the civilian repair crew in Mannheim, fixing oil lines and gear housings on the same engines he had once helped dismantle in Texas. "They build victory twice," he said one evening, wiping grease from his hands. Rosler, now teaching engineering in Dresden, received a postcard from Weber with that same phrase scribbled across it. "It builds victory." Only this time it meant the victory of life over ruin. The transformation was personal as well as national. Many former German engineers who had studied American machines in captivity went on to influence the rebirth of West German industry. The concept of modular design, standardization, and large-scale manufacturability, all lessons learned from American equipment, shaped post-war companies like MAN, Daimler-Benz, and Hanomag. The ghosts of Peoria and Pittsburgh whispered through every post-war blueprint. On a misty November morning, Weber returned to the same bulldozer he had seen months before. Its engine was quiet, its blade resting on the ground. He placed his hand on the metal, cold, solid, and alive with memory. Around him, workers laid asphalt, and a tram bell rang faintly through the fog. The war that had consumed his youth had ended, but its machines had outlived it, finding a nobler purpose. He closed his eyes and thought of that day in Italy when he had first seen the machine half buried in mud. Back then, it had represented defeat. Now it symbolized something far greater, the power to rebuild what men had destroyed. Somewhere beyond the city, another engine started, its growl rolling across the valley like a promise. Years later, when the smoke of history had settled into memory, men like Weber, Krauss, and Rosler no longer spoke of defeat and victory in the language of flags. They spoke, instead of motion, of machines that never stopped turning, of a new kind of strength that came not from domination, but from endurance. The bulldozer, once dismissed as an auxiliary tool, had become, in their eyes, the truest emblem of the 20th century. A machine that could destroy, then rebuild, with equal determination. In post-war Europe, its echo remained everywhere. Roads that once carried tanks now carried school buses. Airfields that once launched bombers now guided cargo planes filled with food and medicine. The same steel tracks that had crushed defenses now pressed foundations for bridges, markets, and homes. What had begun as a tool of conquest had become an agent of continuity, proof that technology, in the hands of humanity, could learn to heal as easily as it had learned to harm. Weber died in 1962, still keeping a small Caterpillar pin on his desk, a memento given by an American engineer who had visited Stuttgart to supervise a construction project. Krauss retired as a consultant for an equipment firm that supplied both Germany and the United States. Rosler's students, in lectures decades later, would hear him say, "Machines are innocent. They do what we make of them. The question is whether we build to endure or to erase." And perhaps that is the lesson buried in their story. That progress itself is neither moral nor immoral, but a mirror of our intent. The bulldozer did not care whether it cleared battlefields or playgrounds, yet the hands that guided it, once hardened by war, learned again how to shape rather than shatter. Somewhere, in a forgotten archive or a faded photograph, a bulldozer still stands in a field under the low European sun. Its blade dull with rust, its seat empty, yet its presence serene. It reminds us that the truest victories are not won by how far we advance, but by what we choose to rebuild after we stop.